Frank Gallagher got a new liver, not a metaphorical one, a literal transplanted organ made possible by another person's death, given to a man who had spent decades drinking his first one into failure. And for a moment, the show lets you believe it might mean something, that this is the turning point, that Frank Gallagher, of all people, is finally going to become someone different. And then he started drinking again. The easy reading is that Frank couldn't stop. That addiction won, that he simply didn't have the strength. But I don't think that's what happened. I think Frank Gallagher understood exactly what he was doing when he picked up that drink. Not because the knowledge wasn't there, but because knowledge was never the thing that was going to save him. That distinction between knowing and being able to act on what you know is what Shameless spent 11 seasons building. And once you see it, Frank stops looking like a cautionary tale about addiction and starts looking like something much more uncomfortable, something more recognizable than most of us want to admit. There's also a question hiding inside his story that the show never asks directly. And the answer isn't Frank. It's someone who grew up in the same house, inherited the same brain, and stood at the exact same crossroads 20 years later. But we will get there. Before we get there, we need to establish something the chaos surrounding Frank makes easy to miss. Frank Gallagher is not stupid. In fact, he's one of the most cognitively sophisticated people in the entire show. And that's the central problem. Because if Frank were simply not smart enough to understand what was happening to him, the story would be easy to explain. That's not what Shameless gives us. Watch how Frank operates when he actually applies himself. He doesn't just run scams, he engineers them. He understands bureaucratic systems at a level most people never develop, learns which institutional loopholes can be exploited, which offices have overworked staff, how to walk into a room full of people with legitimate credentials and talk his way through situations that should be impossible to survive. In a different life, pointed in a different direction, that ability would look like competence, maybe even success. But Frank doesn't use that intelligence to build anything. He uses it to avoid building anything. Every scam is a way not to work. Every speech is a way not to act. Every clever justification is another layer of insulation between Frank and the reality he refuses to sit with. He's one of the most cognitively capable people on the South Side, and he has spent decades deploying that capability toward a single goal, making sure he never has to stop moving long enough to feel the full weight of what his life has become. And once you see that inversion, capability deployed entirely in the service of avoidance, the rest of the character starts making a different kind of sense. Because Frank isn't failing despite his intelligence, he's failing through it. That's a much harder thing to explain, and a much harder thing to watch. And that's the first piece of the puzzle. Frank knows. He has always known. Knowledge was never the problem. Which means the problem has to be something else entirely. Something the show has been hiding in plain sight since the very first episode. So Frank knows. His intelligence is real. His awareness is real. And yet none of it changes anything. Which raises the next question, and it's an uncomfortable one. Is Frank Gallagher actually capable of loving anyone besides himself? The easy answer is no. Frank is selfish, destructive, treats the people around him as resources rather than people. That reading is understandable. It's also incomplete, because Monica Gallagher exists. When Monica is in Frank's life, he comes alive, not in a redemptive, cleaned-up way, but in the specific way that happens when someone finally feels understood. Monica didn't fix Frank or make him want to be better. What she did was something more dangerous than that. She made him feel like he didn't need to be. Because Monica wasn't just the love of Frank's life, she was his mirror. The two of them shared the same gravitational pull toward chaos, the same instinct to disappear whenever life started asking something real of them. And what made their relationship feel like love to Frank, not because it was healthy, not because it was good for anyone around them, was that it was the first time the version of himself he actually lived as every day felt like enough. Monica confirmed that who he already was made sense. That's not a love story. That's a trap that felt like home. And that trap explains something about Frank's children that pure neglect never could. Because what Frank passed on to them wasn't just absence. It was a specific education in what love looks like when it never quite becomes action. And every one of his children graduated from that education with a different scar. Because Frank didn't just fail his children, he failed them each in a completely different way. Same father, 6 different outcomes. And the damage is tailored in a way that tells you exactly what Frank understood about each of them and chose not to do anything about. The problem, and this is where the character becomes genuinely difficult to look at, is that love and responsibility are not the same thing. And Frank Gallagher spent 11 seasons feeling one while consistently failing to sustain the other. A father who leaves creates a clean wound. A father who stays, present enough to make promises, present enough to create the kind of hope only a parent can create, and then consistently fails to show up anyway, creates something that doesn't heal the same way. Frank was always there. He just was never there in the way that counted. And nowhere is the damage more specific than Fiona. By the time we meet her, she's already a parent, not to her own children, but to his. Managing finances that don't add up, making decisions no person her age should have to make, holding together a family Frank assembled and walked away from. What makes it devastating isn't the responsibility itself. It's that Frank wasn't gone. He was right there, present enough to be a constant reminder of everything that wasn't happening, present enough to show up and make a promise, present enough to leave again when the promise became inconvenient. Fiona doesn't grow up wondering whether her father loved her. She grows up understanding that love without follow-through is just a feeling, and she internalizes that not as a lesson, but as an identity. She becomes the person who shows up, the person who carries it, not because it's strength, because it's adaptation. A child building herself around the specific shape of her father's absence. Ian, Debbie, and Carl each find their own version of that adaptation. Same father, different wounds, different survival strategies built around the same central absence. But there's one child who didn't just adapt to Frank's failure. One child who inherited something far more complicated. The thing Frank actually had. The intelligence, the verbal agility, the ability to read a room in 10 seconds and give it exactly what it wants, and then spent years watching what Frank did with it. His name is Lip, and once you see what the show is doing with him, Frank Gallagher stops feeling like a finished product. He starts feeling like a pattern. One that was running long before Frank became Frank, and one that isn't finished yet. What did Frank look like before he became Frank? Before the excuses calcified into identity, before disappointment stopped being a feeling and became a personality? The show answers that question. It just never announces that it's doing it. His name is Lip Gallagher. The similarities between Lip and Frank aren't surface level. They're structural. The intelligence operates the same way, fast, lateral, slightly ahead of whatever conversation it's in. The verbal agility is identical. The deep, almost constitutional skepticism toward institutions and anyone who tells him what his potential should look like. Identical. Even the arrogance has the same specific flavor, not the arrogance of someone who thinks they're better than everyone. The arrogance of someone who can see exactly how the game is rigged and resents being told to play it anyway. At first, watching Lip feels like watching a better story. The version where the Gallagher intelligence escapes the South Side instead of being consumed by it. Professors root for him. Opportunities appear that Frank never had. And for a while, the show lets you believe Lip is proof that Frank's outcome wasn't inevitable. Then the drinking starts. And I want you to notice something about how it happens, because the show doesn't give you a dramatic rock bottom. It gives you something much quieter than that. One compromise, one rationalization, one night that becomes two. The same sequence, beat for beat, that probably played out in Frank's life 20 years earlier, in a version of the story none of us ever got to see. And suddenly, you're not watching Lip's story anymore. You're watching two timelines at once, the one where Lip becomes Frank and the one where he doesn't. Every setback carries double weight. Every near miss feels like a preview. Every time Lip gets close to the edge, you feel the pull of the parallel. Not because the show tells you to, but because you've been watching Frank long enough to know exactly where that edge leads. Which means, for the first time in 11 seasons, Frank Gallagher stops feeling like an ending and starts feeling like a warning that came too late. Not for Lip necessarily. The show is careful not to make that verdict final. But for Frank. Because Lip is the closest thing Shameless ever gives us to proof that the version of Frank who didn't become Frank was real, that he existed, that there was a moment, probably several moments, where the story could have gone differently, and didn't. Lip doesn't just make Frank's tragedy visible. He makes it imaginable. He gives Frank a beginning the show never shows us directly. And once you have that beginning, the ending stops feeling inevitable and starts feeling like a choice. A series of choices, each one small enough to seem survivable, each one making the next one slightly more likely. That's Frank's lesson. Not the one he ever intended to teach, the one he demonstrated constantly without realizing anyone was watching closely enough to learn it. There's something else the Lip parallel makes visible. Frank Gallagher spent years rehearsing his own death, not metaphorically, literally. Across 11 seasons, Frank fakes terminal illnesses, manufactures medical emergencies, performs emotional breakdowns with a consistency that takes real skill, trembling hands, genuine tears, just enough specific detail to make people believe they're watching something real. On the surface, those scenes play as comedy. Classic Frank, another con. But here's what's actually happening underneath them. Frank understands that dying creates a specific kind of attention, forgiveness, and connection he cannot generate any other way. That vulnerability opens doors that performance closes. So he performs vulnerability. He borrows emotional weight from mortality and spends it on forgiveness he hasn't worked for, on relationships he damaged and wants back without paying the cost of repair. It works, repeatedly, because the people Frank does it to love him, and love makes the accounting harder. But the accounting always comes due eventually, and what Shameless does with that reckoning is one of the strangest and most honest things the show ever pulls off. Because it doesn't arrive as punishment or dramatic consequence. It arrives as something much quieter and much more unsettling than either of those things. Frank spends the genuine emotional content of his own death years before he actually dies. Performance by performance, tearful speech by tearful speech, until by the time the real thing arrives, there's nothing left in reserve. No grand revelation, no transformation, no moment where mortality says something. Frank hasn't already said himself in a bar to an audience that half believed him, which means when the ending comes, it isn't a verdict. It's just Frank at a bar telling another version of a story he's told before. The same man, the same choices, the same gap, until the thing that was always going to happen finally happens. And that brings us back one last time to the liver. Frank Gallagher gave speeches. He stood in bars and on sidewalks and occasionally behind actual podiums and delivered arguments about poverty and addiction and inequality that were often genuinely insightful. He could diagnose the trap with a precision that made you stop and listen even when you didn't want to. He could describe exactly how it worked, exactly who built it, exactly why the people caught inside it kept making choices that looked self-destructive from the outside. He knew. He always knew. And then he ordered another drink. That gap between the speech and the drink is the entire character. And what I've come to think, after spending a long time with Frank Gallagher, is that the gap was never about intelligence or awareness or information. Frank had all of those in abundance. What he didn't have was belief. Belief that the version of Frank Gallagher who didn't drink, who showed up, who followed through, was a person he was actually capable of being. That the distance between the man giving the speech and the man at the bar was a distance he could cross. Frank didn't grow up in a vacuum. He grew up in circumstances that were already broken before he arrived in them. His father drank. The pattern that consumed him existed before he did. He inherited it the same way Lip inherited it from him. That doesn't excuse what Frank became, but it means his gap isn't as foreign as it's comfortable to believe. Frank just lived inside that gap longer than most, until the gap became the whole life. And that's the moment the liver stops being a plot point and becomes the whole argument. Because a second chance assumes the person receiving it has access to a version of themselves that can use it differently. Frank didn't have that access, not because it was impossible, but because 11 seasons of choices had made it feel that way. And feelings, it turns out, are a much more powerful force than facts, even when you know the facts perfectly. The new liver was a gift, a second chance at years he had spent decades destroying. And Frank started drinking again, not because he didn't understand what it meant, not because the awareness was missing, but because the version of himself who could do something different with it was a person he had never fully learned how to be. 11 seasons wasn't enough time to learn it. The knowledge was there from the beginning. The belief never quite arrived. And in the end, sitting at that bar, telling that story, being exactly who he always was right up until the moment he wasn't anymore, I think Frank Gallagher knew that too. He just never figured out what to do with knowing it.